it is data. Someone said, to borrow Wayne's example, why do bank robbers go to bank to steal? Because that's where the money lies. And in earlier days, stealing from a bank involved like putting on a mask, a fake gun or a real gun, and there was a risk involved. But nowadays, you can steal that from the comfort of your own basement. So asset is what we are trying to protect. For a company, it can be people, property, information. So your customer information, your company critical code, your database, your intellectual property, all these are considered assets. What is a threat? A threat is any circumstance or event that can pose a danger to steal that asset. So somebody, trying to break into my application is a threat. And a vulnerability, now think about it. You have your asset, then you have the threat of somebody trying to break in, but your application or code has to have a weakness so that people can exploit that weakness and steal the data. So vulnerability is a weakness in your systems, in your website, in your application, in your firewall. So it is when a vulnerability is exploited, then you have a big risk, right? So in cybersecurity, which is essentially an exercise in risk management, we start with what is the asset? What are you trying to protect? What are the threats that are trying to steal this asset? What are the inherent weaknesses in your system that will allow this stealing? And risk is at the center of this Venn diagram. And what we do, we look at the risks and we mitigate the risks by applying various security controls. So in essence, cybersecurity is an exercise in risk management. And also, a couple of things about risk. It is like, there is a risk for everything, right? If I go out and walk on the street, there is a risk that there can be an earthquake and the ground collapses. That's one kind of risk. There can be a risk that if I'm, driving a bike without a helmet, if I get injured, I'll hurt my head. That's a risk. There's a risk that you have your company software and your company website, and you haven't put a firewall on it. That's a risk. So every risk is associated with a likelihood. So there are percentages allocated to every risk. We cannot fix everything. So we see that this asset has a higher risk because it has all these threats and it's accessible. So in IT world, if you're having a public facing asset, it can be accessed by anybody in the entire world versus an internal asset, which is protected or supposed to be protected. So one thing to keep in mind is if you're protecting an asset that's worth, let's say, $10 million, you cannot apply security controls that are worth $20 million because it defeats the purpose, right? If you're protecting an asset that's worth $10 million with $1 million or 500,000 or 100,000, you're doing a good job. So I'll stop here. Should we continue? We'll go through the slides and then we'll get into some hands-on stuff.
Sure, go on.
Cool. Thank you, Brad. So Now, what is threat modeling? Threat modeling is looking at your assets and trying to identify all the different kinds of threats that pose a danger to your asset. So this is like the starting point of your developing a cybersecurity program in your organization. Have a good threat model. Threat model looks at all the risks, like Wayne's example. Physically, he went in and stole the money. So that's a threat. You're not validating the badges, or your employees are not trained for social engineering attacks. That's one kind of threat. So threat modeling goes into all the different kinds of threats. So this is a sample application. The visual is not very clear, but if you can see the red dotted lines, these red dotted lines represent trust boundaries. So this is a public trust boundary. Let's say you have your sensitive data in this database. So you have your website here. Then there's another on your demilitarized zone, DMZ. Then you have your internal assets, your application server, which is processing that data. That's in a segmented network. And then at the very end, you have your database, which can only be accessed by one specific system. So for any assets that we have in our organization, if we can identify where our data is and build these trust boundaries and make sure that that we make sure we do not, we limit the trust boundaries. For example, if somebody did not do threat modeling, then they could keep their database on the public facing arena, which is a huge risk. So this is why we need to map out our network, and then we need to apply security is based on the principle of least privilege. So if my application server needs to talk to database, I will not let anybody else talk to my database server. So there are ways to validate that. So that is an example of threat modeling. So ideally, threat modeling should be initiated when you're building an application, if you're in the development arena. So through simple diagrams, you can draw on your whiteboard and look at the threats and mitigate it. This is a link to a very nice tool Microsoft made where you can define all the assets in your network and then look at the threat modeling view, and it'll immediately tell you, oh, I identified these risks. So we'll not have time to go into this, but I'll share the link if you're interested. So this is how the tool looks like. So once you build up your system architecture, then you change your view here to analysis view. So it says, oh, there's a cross-site scripting, there's an elevation privilege. These are the different kinds of risks. Okay. Now, there are different techniques of threat modeling. So one technique is called STRIDE. STRIDE looks at, oh, somebody else joined, Rudy. Okay, STRIDE is an acronym for STRIDE. S stands for spoofing. So let's say you have an application and you have your email. Let's say, for simple example, your email. Somebody can spoof their identity or hack your password or get your password from a publicly breached site, right? And then they can use that password to break into your Gmail. So how can you mitigate it? By securing your password, maybe having multi-factor authentication, implementing some kind of Signatures, if you have that kind of control over the email system. Similarly, tampering is when someone can break into your database and alter some sensitive data, so like patient data. Or a funny example is when in a recent security breach, some students in a Greek university, they broke in and they all increased their scores. They all got hundreds, right? So if you have a good file integrity monitoring check, they'll say, hey, you just got this alert that somebody changed your file information from the backend. Repudiation is something you cannot deny. So let's say, as kids, like we would love to steal cookies from a mother's cookie jar, right? And let's say we are blaming it on a sibling, that I didn't steal it, he or she stole it. But if your mother has a video camera, which is obviously too much in the case of for protecting cookies, but like you cannot deny it because there's a footage that shows that, yeah, you were the guy who could not resist those cookies, right? You couldn't wait for Christmas. So having good logging in terms of IT assets, having good logging and monitoring, making sure you are tracking everybody's information, who's logging into your system, from what server, what activities they are performing, is essential. If you don't do this, and if there is a breach and you don't have logs, then you can be sued for lack of due diligence, right? Not only are you hampering the investigation, but you didn't do the basic things. You're not logging who's accessing your system. Information disclosure. When you're having some error messages, or just don't make your organization's information accessible to the public. Try to protect your personal life as well, because you're disclosing where you're going for a vacation, right, on social media, for example. And then the hackers know, okay, if somebody is monitoring you, they know that nobody's going to be there in the house at that time. So personally, I post all my vacation pictures after I've come back from the vacation. Denial of service, self-explanatory, where you're bombarding your organization with some misconfigured package that's making the service unusable to actual valid users. Some hacktivists carry out this kind of operation occasionally, or your competitor or some business partner with whom the relationship didn't end well can also buy a denial of service from the internet and try to bombard your website. So I've been involved in such kind of denial of service prevention attacks. They're not fun. But if you have good controls, like a good firewall, good segmentation, you can fight these denial of service attacks. And lastly, elevation of privilege is, let's say you log into your bank as a regular user, but because of some vulnerability, you're able to increase your access level from a regular user to an admin user, and you can access everybody's bank data. So you can use this. And the last slide is, again, this is talking about the same mechanism, but now it's going into the technical controls. These are the technical controls I can use to prevent this kind of attacks. And then once you identify these attacks, then you brainstorm what are the countermeasures, what countermeasures make sense, and you sleep in peace, which is our goal at the end of the day. So I will stop there for a minute. Brad or Suk or hey Rudy, good to see you. Or Adam, if you have any questions.
How you doing? It's great to see you, man.
Yeah. Awesome,
All right.
awesome. Rudy, you want to Hey, Rudy, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey guys, I am Rudy Aramayo and known Shamik for many years now. I'm here, developer in the Bay Area.
Oh, excellent.
When you say Bay Area, you say San Francisco Bay Area or a different area of Bay?
I work for the Apple hardware team, Cupertino.
Nice, good for you. You and I are close by.
Nice.
I'm pretty much Shuk is also close by too. She's SAP, I think it's South San Francisco, if I'm not wrong.
Nice.
But my job is remote. So.
I cannot hear you, I'm sorry.
She works remotely. She doesn't care. Where
Oh, you're lucky. Well, good. It's good to see multiple people here.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I kind of have is like too bad the data flow diagram, that one is a little bit blurred. It would have been nicer if a little bit more clearer, but I'm pretty sure you'll find a better copy later on.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Having a data flow diagram is very important because if you don't know how your assets are positioned, how would you know where to apply those boundaries? Yeah.
I have a question for you, Sammy.
Yeah.
And anybody else that's on the call here. So where does virus and malware fit on that list of threats that you went through?
Where does virus and malware fit into this whole flow?
Oh, in
Yeah.
Stride, I think he means, like in the threat model.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So let's look at the Stride model again. And maybe Trevor, you want to take that question, putting you on the spot?
So could you repeat the question one more time? Let me. Yeah, where does malware fall into this? Is what you're asking, right?
Yeah, so we're talking about these threats, and these are all kind of like intrusion threats.
Yeah.
Coming in from the outside and trying to hack in your system and do something
Yeah.
from externally. But if somebody brings some device and connects it to your network that's infected, or you download some, you go to a website and click on something and it downloads some malware in your system. Where does that fit in this kind of bundle?
So I guess all that malware really necessarily is it's just an automated, it's just automated attacks pretty much. So each one of these attacks could be done by a human as well as it could be done by malware. Well, I don't know about denial of service being done by malware. But if you just there could be malware that's designed to, when it gets into your system, see if it can escalate privilege, which that malware would fall under elevation of privilege. But at the very same time, if I am physically hacked into your computer without malware, well, I mean, probably malware got me there, but let's say I'm on your computer for some reason, I could manually escalate privilege without malware. So where malware comes in really dangerous is that I can't sit here all day and try every computer system in the world. There's just way too many and I'd be here forever. So what attackers will do is they will make malware, and a lot of times it can be sophisticated malware, but a lot of times it's just crude malware that will test for these. And really it's more of like a quantity over quality type thing where they just send them out to the internet and they just will crawl the internet and try everyone and try to infect them. Of course, there's also targeted malware, which would be like a phishing attack with specific malware that they want someone to click on, which can then infect. So really malware can be many different types of these.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Can I ask?
Answer, yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead, Adam.
No, I just wanted to ask this question. I'm seeing more and more of clients moving everything to 100% cloud, Azure, AWS, and even despite that, they still have firewall system, they still have access points. Some of them have 100 locations, and sometimes they have pre-shared keys they're using, which is not locked down. So I want to find out what is the perspective on companies have everything in the cloud and even having everything in Azure? What if someone compromised their account? I mean, that still freaked me out too. I mean, they go in there, they delete, and you're doomed. So tell me more about how you guys what is the perspective about companies going 100% cloud, and what would you recommend to prevent them from being hacked? 'Cause even that is hackable too.
Yeah, that's a good question, Adam. And I was looking up did you hear about the Capital One credit card hack that happened a few
I
years
saw the news, but I
ago?
didn't pay attention to it. Yeah.
Right. So that was an exactly, this like the scenario that you just described. Right.
Oh.
So in this particular case, and I'll pull up a diagram real quick.
Sure.
The developers had kept the authentication credentials within their code.
Oh.
And that code was discovered, it was in GitHub in a public repository. So now the attackers were able to steal that code and get into their AWS infrastructure and steal lots of data. So that's one thing, one mistake. But then they didn't configure their AWS properly. So instead of using a credential to connect to the database, they should have used roles. So there are ways to configure cloud to mitigate these kind of risks.
All right, so there is possibility. I do have another customer, as a gaming company. They have both on-prem and cloud. To make matters a little bit more worse is they have multiple servers like Windows, PC, Mac, Linux. So it's a target waiting to explode. Somebody somehow want to hack them, and they're a popular gaming company. And so are you guys going to look at all of those features? Do you guys have application program to kind of like detect each and every single application? Because they have those in Azure, and they also have some of those on-prem as well too.
Yeah, Rudy and I both worked at the gaming company. That's where we met. And what you're talking about can happen to any companies that are both on-prem and on cloud. And there is a huge initiative for all organizations, especially organizations like Sook's organization, huge organization. They are moving everything to cloud, because everything's getting remote. Nobody wants to come into the office or data center anymore. So I used to actually, as security professional, I had to review and approve some of these applications that were migrating. And I was like, you can't migrate this. This is 20-year-old code. Nobody knows what it's doing. And their counter argument was, you're right, but in the cloud, I can secure it better.
Sorry.
Right? Because in the data center on-prem, it's a flat network. If they want to segment that, contain that risk, they'll have to put firewalls around it and switches and segmentation and all that. Migrate it to the cloud. Within a few seconds, you can have those security controls. You can observe what's happening in and out of the activity. So one thing that people don't realize about the cloud is there is the cloud provider, that is AWS, is responsible for security of the cloud, the whole infrastructure. But as a customer, you're responsible for data in your cloud. Right? So it's a 50-50 mutual relationship.
That's a good point that you pointed out, by the way. I'm asking a lot of questions. I'm a curious George, even though my name is Adam. So that's a good point putting over there. Like, should they go for virtual firewall system, like maybe a virtual Meraki firewall system, some form of FortiGate firewall? Because some company, like, they were debating, like, hey, should we have a virtual firewall system for our virtualization systems or not? So they're debating between the two. I mean, what is the perspective on that?
So excellent question. So we will go back to the data flow diagram, right? First, you need to map out your application so that you know your trust boundaries. And how you segment your network, it can happen through multiple ways. You can use AWS security groups, which is a host-based firewall. You don't need to buy a virtual firewall. AWS provides a lot of native offerings that you can leverage without buying a third-party device.
And to add on that too, I would like to say that another big thing is like a layered defense. So I'm sure Wayne can attest to this from pen testing. Like the best scenario in pen testing is if all the hardware is the same, because if you can get into one, you can get into everything then. So that's where I think it's kind of good to have a combination of different types of hardware firewalls and even different types of virtual firewalls, and just make it absolutely miserable for anybody trying to hack in past them.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, vendor diversity is an amazing network security tool. Because, okay, yeah, I have a Windows server. If all I have is a Windows server, all I need to know to be able to break that Windows server and make it do whatever I want is Active Directory. But if I have a Windows and a Mac server, well, now I need to know 2 different operating systems. If I have Windows, Mac, and Linux, well, now I need to know 1,800 different operating systems depending on the distro of Linux you're running, right? So it's while there are some inherent weaknesses with trying to run multiple vendors from a security standpoint, it's also a very good idea to diversify your vendors, because that forces any potential attacker to have to know either multiple systems or multiple vendors, or it's kind of like a natural segmentation. If all I know is Windows and you're running Windows and Mac, I can't do anything to your Mac network. It's secure by, I guess, obfuscation at this point.
Rudy gives you a thumbs up. Yes. That's a very good idea, to mix it up, to confuse the attacker. That's what we are doing, right, at the end of the day. Sometimes with multiple vendors, it just becomes a challenge to manage them, pay multiple people. So, you can look into that as well. If somebody is providing a consolidated solution, always good to take that route. So just to kind of summarize what we discussed, start with drawing a technical diagram, highlight what has to be protected, brainstorm. This is a free flow, like the Stride is just a suggested modeling. There are other threat modeling techniques available, like Dread and all like automated threat modeling. There are more and more threat modeling techniques and coming up every day, but it's just a recommendation to kind of organize your thought processes. And then once you've got all those threats listed, prioritize and vote. Agree, because you may have had a personal experience which makes you biased towards one specific type of risk, right? Have a consensus among your organization. There are multiple ways of prioritizing risk. It can be qualitative and quantitative. So you assign a dollar value to the asset and a dollar value to the countermeasure. And then identify, you can boil the ocean, identify top 5 threats and add the fixes to backlog.
I'd like to bring up here real quick, if that's okay, Attackmitre.org.
Yeah.
That's another example of a threat modeling site, and it gives you tactics, techniques, and procedures on what to do based on whatever the attack is. It also suggested remediations or counterpoints, counter proposals. How do I solve it? How do I fix it? If I can't outright fix it, how do I mitigate it? So that may also be a good point of reference.
Oh, excellent.
Repeat the name of that site?
Yeah, here's the link to that site. I was actually planning to bring it up. So attack.mitre.org, right? So you can look at all the adversary techniques, right? This is the initial reconnaissance, how they gather information, they phish, then they compromise an account, then they do initial access, then they execute the malware. They stay there. Once they are there, they sit there quietly and observe what's happening. Then they escalate their privilege, move in from a regular user to an admin user, and then, ultimately how they exfiltrate data right? They build up their own botnet, and what is the impact of that? So you can, these are some of the groups that, like, these are all the hacker groups. So if you look at, these are their names. This is APT1, Chinese threat group. Okay, let's see what kind of tactics they involve. These are the techniques they use. They first discover a local account and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And that's how you can tell who's in your network. Even if you're under a cyber attack, you can collect all of those different TTPs, techniques, and procedures that they're doing. And you can put that in there, and that'll actually tell you it's most likely, this hacker group or from this country or something like that.
Yeah.
Also, I wanted to say one thing about the cloud thing that I forgot to mention earlier. With the cloud too, one of the biggest things I think in cloud security is that there's like two types of cloud. There's a shared cloud server, and that I think is I would not put sensitive data on that, like, ever, just because I feel like somebody could at some point get in through the server and then have access to every other instance on there. But you can get like private.
Shared cloud?
What was that?
What do you mean by shared cloud?
So what that means is, like, right now, like, if I go to just AWS and I just spin up like an instance, there's like an Amazon data center, right? And they just have like rows and rows and rows of servers. So you by default don't get your own server. You're actually sharing servers with other people who have other instances on the cloud. So where that becomes an issue is if, let's say Brad, you got your stuff on the cloud, and let's say Adam has his stuff on the cloud, and you're on the same server. And let's say I hack into Adam. Okay, and now Adam and Brad don't know each other at all. Your businesses aren't related. You guys are on the other side of the country. But because I got into the physical server that's running Adam's stuff, I can then pivot from there to your stuff. So that's why you have to get like a private cloud instance, a private server for sensitive information, so that nobody else is having access to that physical server but you.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. So you're right. Public cloud and private cloud. Yeah.
Yes, there's public cloud, there's a private cloud, and then there's a shared where you're allowed to mix between the two. And that'll allow you to have a public facing website, for example. And then they're right. If it's shared with the resource, you'll be able to dive in to public S3 data.
Excellent.
I've
Yeah.
got a question for you. So our company's looking to move more to the cloud. And really just using applications that are cloud-based and they're in aws.gov. So they would presumably be in a public cloud then, those applications?
I don't know with your scenario because you're using a different AWS than the default one. So I don't know if there might be some differences there, but the safest thing is I would assume yes.
The government websites are all shared infrastructure cloud public. I remember from AWS training, I think.
Oh, okay. It is. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And so if we've got an application that is hosted in that environment and we want to access it, we're a fairly small company, not a lot of deep pockets, and we're just, kind of not very mature in our cybersecurity policies. But if we implement some sort of a two-factor authentication with that, and then is that about as good as we can get to start with?
It depends on what you want on the cloud. So if you don't need anything to be like publicly accessible, then there are other ways that it could be done that are just easier, more efficient, stuff like that. So
Okay.
it's like I said, with cloud security, it's all about the configuration. It's all about like the scenario too. So it really depends on like what you want in there, how much you want on it, how easy it is to access, who's accessing it.
Okay, so I probably want to have a follow-up conversation with you guys about some of that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Some of those servers are not on the line all the time. And so if you get a really expensive one that's always active, that's one thing, but some of them, they have to be called upon and then instantiated, right? So those they can be per instance uses, for example, or you can do the cloud computing where you just, it's Lambda functions. So you just execute a Lambda function and then it gives back the response. So there's no actual server. There's a bunch of different ways to cut that one.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Wayne's got to go, so we should all probably end. But thank you so much. This was our first attempt, and we really enjoyed the interaction. So we'll only get better from here. And thank you. Please join again when we have our next one.
Just curious, will you be able to share that PowerPoint?
Yeah. You want the PowerPoint slides? Yeah,
I
definitely.
just wanted to, it was interesting content. I just like to see what we didn't get all the way through it.
Well, yeah, I'll do that. Thank you guys, Brad and Chris.
All right, thank you.
Have a good afternoon. Good to see all of old
Yeah,
friends.
pleasure meeting
you.
Friends.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Nice meeting all of you. Goodbye.